Alright guys, well, it finally happened. It's been almost exactly 1 month to the day since the Enter the World of Kislev trailer, and we have just now received the unit roster in its totality. Every single unit we can expect to see when the third part of this trilogy finally makes landfall sometime later this year. Now, it's important to frame this reveal in the context of Warhammer 3 as a whole. Remember, we're going to have 7 unique races on launch day, 4 Chaos Gods, Cathay, Kislev, and the pre-order bonus. And if you recall, that is substantially more than the starting races we had in Game 1 and Game 2, which I believe both launched with 4. So no matter what happens, we are extremely likely to have more content on Day 1 than we did for Warhammer 1 or for Warhammer 2. And I don't think very many people were complaining about how much content was there for either of those games. So in that context, a single roster not being quite as awesome as some of us wanted it to be initially isn't a massive deal, because we're going to have more unique units, legendary lords, campaigns, and content than we had in the previous games. And obviously, there's a well-established track record of supporting those and further fleshing them out after release, so even if that initial impact isn't what we wanted it to be, it will get better with free LC and DLC along the line. We'll jump into the full roster in a minute here, but for now, just going to leave it on screen for you to peruse at your own leisure. Now, probably the biggest reveal in this entire announcement is that Tsar Boris is super duper dead. And I quote, "Ascending to the throne in the wake of her father's bloody death fighting against the hordes of chaos, Katarin has wasted no time cementing her grip upon Kislev." Now, personally, I don't think this is surprising. I felt like it was hinted at pretty clearly in the announcement cinematic that he was sending a last will and testament, a warning of sorts to his daughter right before the end, and that the only reason Tsarina Katarin would even rightfully claim the throne is with the death of her father. That's how succession works. Considering all of that info mirrored exactly what we know about Tsar Boris and his death in the lore, it all just kind of fit right on that front, and I was surprised how many people thought he was for sure still alive after that first trailer was posted. Regardless, it's good to finally have confirmation, and with the fact that there are so many bear elements in this army already, creating a DLC for him later would have probably been a weird stylistic choice. I like the idea of a Kislev start position far in the north, surrounded by bad guys possibly in the wastes, but it won't be happening for Boris unless they pull a crazy fast one on us, and I guess that is possible, but unlikely, because it sounds like the dude is currently getting snacked on by a horde of demons. Ripperoonies to Big Daddy Boris Boca. Let's get some F's in the chat. With that out of the way, I can't help but feel a bit disappointed by the Kislev army reveal here, for multiple reasons. It's not all doom and gloom. There's lots of highlights to be excited for, not just for the game as a whole, but for Kislev too. But yeah, overall, I think this is one of the weaker roster reveals we've had in this trilogy, which is sad, because it should have been one of the most exciting, with the most room to explore and experiment outside the source material, because of the nature of Kislev itself. It's a minor faction without an official modern army book. They had more room to flex their muscles here and get creative. Like I said, the Enter the World of Kislev trailer launched on May 18th. The roster reveal probably should have dropped maybe a day or two after that, honestly, but instead we're getting it on June 15th, a month later, and there isn't much to show for that gap. Perhaps the marketing team had a good reason to delay the reveal an entire month. I don't know. I can't think of what that reason would be, but ultimately, that delay will make this whole affair fall a bit flat, because there's almost nothing in it that we didn't already know. And in fact, I think it's actually going to confirm a lot of people's initial negative impressions in terms of the bear and ice themes kind of being flanderized. I mean, look, the obvious conclusion the fanbase will draw from waiting a month for the full roster is that there's cool stuff that hasn't been on display yet. It doesn't make sense to wait that long after the trailer to diffuse all the hype and let it all kind of fizzle out unless there's something more coming. But if we take a look at the units that are present here and the available mount choices for lords and heroes in Kislev, almost none of it is new, or rather, it's not content we haven't already seen. Let's take a look. So, for legendary lords, we have Tsarina Katarin with the Lore of Ice, and she can mount a warhorse or warbear. Supreme Patriarch Kostaltyn will be her counterpart, also mounted on a warhorse or warbear. For generic Kislev lords, we've got a Boyar and Ice Witch with Lore of Ice or Lore of Tempest. Both of them can only mount warhorses or warbears. And for Kislev heroes, we have Frost Maidens and Patriarchs, Lore of Ice or Lore of Tempest on the Frost Maiden hero, warhorse or warbear, and for the Patriarch, warhorse or warbear. The only mounts in the entirety of the roster are warhorse or warbear. There are no unique mounts for either Katarin or Kostaltyn either, and from what it looks like, they aren't recolored or renamed, in the way that Seraphon is a special black dragon for Malekith, for example. For Kislev Infantry, we have Kossars with bow and axe, Kossars with bow and spear, Streltsy, Ice Guard with bow and dual sword, or Ice Guard with bow and glaive, Armored Kossars, pistol and axe, Armored Kossars, pistol and great mace, Zargard with sword and shield, or great sword. And for Kislev Cavalry, we have Kossovite Dervishes, which are a new unit we'll talk about in a second here, Wing Lancers, Griffin Legion, Warbear Riders, Horse Archers, Light War Sleds, and Heavy War Sleds. And for Monsters and Beasts, we have gotten clarification that that is indeed a Snow Leopard. It's described as a great saber-tooth single-entity battle cat that can be trained to protect the women of the Ice Court, and they're meant to hunt high-value and squishy single entities like mages. But if they team up with others, get a couple of those saber-tooths together, then they can take down some of the more ferocious and heavily armored beasts in the setting. The other monster in the Kislev roster is, of course, the Elemental Bear, which we saw quite well in the trailer and in the quest battle itself. And for artillery, we only have the Little Grom. All in all, certainly not a terrible roster, but if it perhaps looks a little bit bare bones to you, that's because it is. It has less mounts and units than any other race in the trilogy on day one. Now again, it is important to contextualize that with the fact that we're getting more races on launch day than in previous entries, but just looking at Kislev in a vacuum, yeah, it's a pretty small roster. Now, small doesn't equal bad, but really the only unit on this page that we didn't already know about are the Kossovite Dervishes, a light cav unit which is described as Vanguard Blitzkrieg troops with incredible speed, the quintessential hit-and-run attacker. But at the end of the day, it's gonna be a light cav unit. It's hardly an eye-popping or super surprising reveal. In fact, there's less here than we thought there would be, because of the lack of unique mount choices for Legendary Lords, because of the lack of new unit reveals, and because even the multiple bear variants we thought we were getting just turned out to be a single bear unit that got changed halfway through development. All those brown bears we've seen in teasers and trailers don't actually exist. They are all going to be white polar bears in the final game. There are not multiple bear cav variants, there's just the one, which is very surprising in and of itself, because Monstrous Cav almost always gets at least 2 weapon variations, one for bonus versus large, one for sustained melee against infantry. So just on that point alone, I'd really like Creative Assembly to make a second bear cav variant here, one with brown bears, mace and shield, to fight in sustained melee at tier 4, and then keep the polar bear cav as the bonus versus large halberd variant at tier 5. That's pretty low-hanging fruit. It already exists for Necropolis Knights and Demigryph Knights and Cold One Cavalry, and so on. I've kind of always thought of polar bears as quite a rare thing in Kislev, perhaps even exclusive to Boris and his bodyguards, and that they should be reserved for the uber elite and characters of the faction, and then brown bears could perhaps be a bit more ubiquitous for Kislev's Monstrous Cav. And considering that brown bears are truly tied to Slavic countries in our world, it seems weird not to have them in any capacity whatsoever. Not sure I agree with the design decision on that front, and I kinda hope that it will change before launch. But probably the most disappointing part of Kislev's roster for me are the mount choices, which can go a long way in distinguishing Legendary Lords from their generic hero counterparts. I think the ones we have here are very uninspired. Warbear and Horse, for every single Lord and hero in the Kislev roster. I don't believe that's ever been done before in this trilogy for any other faction. Even for the races that don't have many mount choices. Azhag has Skullmuncha for the Greenskins, Sisters of Twilight have Seth and Har and Gwyndolor for the Wood Elves, and so on. I have no problem with bear mounts in and of themselves, but when they're the only available mounts for anybody on the roster, it's just kinda lame. Especially when they don't really belong paired with Katarin or Ice Mages in the first place. There are clear references in the lore to Katarin on a sled, pulled by elk and such. Running around on a bear doesn't really give her the same grace and gravitas as a regal sled would, and in fact it turns her into more of a melee bruiser, along with every other character on the roster. Same for Kostaltyn. Having a unique war altar or something more outside the box would have helped a lot to distinguish him as a character. Not a monster, but something perhaps more religiously motivated, a reliquary of some sort. Instead, there's no special Grand Orthodoxy mount, and in fact, there's no Grand Orthodoxy troop type at all. I don't know what his theme or starting army will look like, or what it will buff. Patriarchs will obviously be tied into his mechanics, but other than that, I'm not really seeing the synergy here when I look at what's available. Imric of Calidor rides with his dragons and knights, Grimgor Ironhide rolls with his black orcs, Cetra has his Tomb Guard and War Sphinxes. Noctilus has his Necrophax Gundams. What does Kostaltyn have that's thematic to him and only him? Every single lord and hero on the roster will be riding a bear, and because it's the same mount as a top tier choice for all of them, we will always see bears because it makes them better, gives them more armor, more HP, and more killing power in melee. It turns the ice mages into actual melee blenders. It makes them a lot better, but when that's the only mount available, it's a lot less exciting. So it feels like we're picking toppings for bears rather than picking lords because they're unique and special in their own right. I think that's a clear-cut design flaw that reduces replayability and faction variety as a whole, and I'm surprised they let that happen in such an obvious way. Straight up, this roster would be received way better by the community if Katarin got a special sled mount and if Kostaltyn got his own unique mount as well. But without it, and with the same mount choices for everyone, it feels a lot more bare bones. Now, that's not to say that Kislev has been done abysmally here, far from it. Many of the unit designs are gorgeous. I'm very excited to see what the lore of Tempest looks like. Sounds awesome. Described as magic that speeds allies along and sends enemies to a swift death, harried from all sides by incredible blizzards and biting cold. The spell names Gust of True Flight, Hailstorm, Swift Wing, Biting Wind, Blizzard, and the Hawks of Mishka, which are an established unit in Kislevite lore, and may very well end up being a summon. I believe it's also been confirmed that elemental bears can be summoned, although there are no spells from either lore that appear capable of doing that, so perhaps a special bound spell for the Ice Queen on her campaign skill tree will be the way that gets implemented, and their focus on versatile, multi-purpose troops will make them a joy to play. I expect them to be very fun. I know there's been a lot of talk about Streltsy. Apparently they used to use Bardishes in the traditional way, as a platform for more accurate shooting, but captains took the more radical step of combining them to reduce weight when on the march. So now all their guns have axes on the other side, and they can make that transition from shooting to melee easier when being charged. I like that idea. Gives it a kind of like nice lore snippet that explains why they made the jump from the old Kislev to the quote-unquote new stuff. And the armored Kossars with pistols and armor-piercing maces sound awesome. They'll be very limited in terms of ammunition, but the opening volleys will put the brakes on enemy formations as they charge home, and it'll function very similarly to what we saw from Precursor Javelins in games like Rome 2. It breaks up the enemy formation, it slows them down, deals some very good damage, but very limited on the ammo aspect. And personally, I love the design of the Ice Guard as elite bodyguards of Katarin. I think they fit her theme perfectly, and I think they're one of those units that really tie in well with her visual aesthetic, and her lore as well. All three of those, the Ice Guard, the Armored Kossars, and the Streltsy, appear to be those kind of multiple battlefield role type units, switching seamlessly between ranged and melee combat. Then you combine that with the fodder Kossars, and you already have the backbone of a roster that can deal with a multitude of threats on the fly. What is also important to remember that Kislev can't fly themselves. They are utterly lacking in flyers, with the possible exception of the Hawks of Mishka spell, which could just as easily be a wind spell and not a summon. But for me, I think the Bear Cav are going to be the highlight of the roster. Incredibly excited to see what they can do, and I'm hoping that CA chooses to add a Brown Bear variant as well. And obviously I'm curious to see what the light cav superiority of Kislev looks like, especially with these new Kosophite dervishes. They should be able to dive into a backline better than most other factions in the setting. I did expect to see a few more rudimentary gunpowder troops here, like an Uragan cannon for some stationary artillery. I think it would have been good to have some stationary emplacements and not just have the Polar Bear Little Grom, but I guess we'll be either waiting for DLC or free LC on that front. And the Baba Yaga elements are entirely and conspicuously missing. It's possible Games Workshop decides not to go that route after all, but there's another wing of Kislev Society that we've never seen before that will be covered and be focused on in the expansions, and not her stuff. But honestly, I think it's more likely the Chicken Huts and Ancient Widow folklore, which I think will still play a major role here, alongside Frost Fiends and all of that stuff, will be held on to for Lord Pack DLC. So this faction is still what we thought they would be. Lots of cav options and maneuverability, powerful ice magic, lacking in the air department almost entirely, but generally versatile with plenty of armor-piercing options, some ranged firepower, and a lot of multi-purpose threats. I hardly think this is some catastrophic unit roster or reveal here. It's not some terrible sign of things to come, especially with Khorne already having essentially been confirmed that their entire demonic roster will be present on launch day, if you look at the 8th edition army book, and a bunch more races and units still to be revealed. I'm not freaking out, I'm not that worried going forward, but when I first saw the Kislev unit roster reveal, I immediately said, damn, this is probably not going to go over that well with the community, and it really comes down to the timing of the marketing, which I guess is not really a new thing that people complain about. People are raging about that stuff all the time. But if they would have just released this a few days after Enter the World of Kislev back in May, sure, there would have still been some backlash and grumbling and grognarding, as there so often is, but we would have already moved past it. Instead, that month delay built up hype and expectation and frustration for no real reason, and more than that, it conveyed that there was more to be seen outside of the quest battle and trailer for Kislev. The reality, though, was that there wasn't much more to display in terms of the unit roster, and so I think a lot of us are just kind of left wondering why they chose to handle it in this manner. Why did we wait a month for a roster reveal when it finally came, there wasn't really anything new to show off anyway? I don't know. It's hardly the end of the world here. Kislev's going to be a very fun faction. There's a lot of it I know I will enjoy. Looking at it on paper, I think it's a solid roster. But again, the marketing for this was handled in a very strange manner, and I think it's going to bite them in their bare butts a little bit on this one. Anyways, let me know what you guys think of the roster in its totality, and I'll see you all in the next video. Indie Pride, signing out for now. Have a good one, guys.